Today marks the start of a water revolution. We are establishing a new partnership where water companies, investors, communities and the government will work together to clean up our rivers, lakes and seas for good.
That's Steve Reed, who's the British Environment Secretary, on the day that the UK government announced the biggest shake-up in water regulation since the industry was privatised more than 30 years ago. And on top of that, we've also got a new 10-year infrastructure strategy which came out earlier this month. So it is turning out to be a really important time for infrastructure investors in the United Kingdom market. I'm Simon Montague, Director of Corporate Affairs at the Global Infrastructure Investor Association, and for this episode we're going to be talking about what these two landmark moments mean for our industry and ultimately for the citizens of the United Kingdom. For the last 3 years, the UK really has been languishing in the popularity stakes. We carry out a twice-a-year pulse survey of how global investors are feeling about different markets around the world. And the problem for the UK has been two things. One, political instability, particularly under the last Conservative government, and above all, unattractive regulation, particularly in the water sector, which really has seen many global investors looking to other markets. The public narrative has been very much focused on the water companies and their owners. But we at GIIA have been looking elsewhere and trying to seek to influence government about what otherwise might be the real problem, and that is, of course, regulation itself. And that's the conclusion that Sir Jon Cunliffe, who's been chairing an independent water commission, has reached as well, concluding that what needs to happen is that off what needs to go, and 4 regulators in total now need to be subsumed into just one super regulator for the water industry. So for this episode, I'm joined by John Phillips, who's Chief Executive of the Global Infrastructure Investor Association, for whom this has really been the biggest campaign that the association has really ever undertaken, and by Eleanor Mack, who's a director at the strategic regulatory advisor Fingleton, and she's well versed in regulatory influencing and change and has worked for clients on the last 2 5-year price reviews for clients in the water industry. Eleanor, thanks for joining us too.
A pleasure to be here, Simon. Thanks for having me.
John, hello.
Hi, Simon.
I'm glad to have you both on board, and we'll get into what is going to be a really fascinating conversation. John, before we get into what Sir Jon Cunliffe's actually recommended in his report, how did we get to where we are? The sort of current situation where we've got regulators, water companies, investors, politicians, and consumers all at loggerheads. It's not a pretty scene right now.
No, it's not a pretty scene. And actually, I think one of the most impressive things that Sir Jon has been able to do in the report that he's published is actually provide a really comprehensive and, I think, pretty accurate analysis of the answer to the question you just posed me. As we see it at GIA, there has been a politicization of the water sector. There have been deliberate and clear choices made by previous politicians to prioritize the lowering of bills at the expense of a proper future planned investment program to address the challenges that are now before us. So that's certainly one area. We've seen a regulator that allowed itself to become politicized and to really enact that political kind of choice, and that really culturally took a decision to start only wielding the stick as opposed to using the carrot alongside it, which I think has set itself very much against the industry and created this adversarial situation. I think it's clear that the industry itself does not cover itself in glory in some of these respects, and has been slow to understand the impacts on these aging assets that they are, which have increasingly failed under the pressure of changing climate impacts, changing consumer habits, changing environmental requirements, and a growing population. So I could carry on, but I think there's, in a nutshell, that is for me the kind of the root of the problems to where we find ourselves today.
John, thank you for setting out that background, because it really is a pretty complicated and long-standing situation that we're in. Eleanor, let's start then looking at what's actually happened with Sir Jon Cunliffe's report. He's published no less than 88 recommendations to sort out the industry. Clearly, we're not going to go through 88 of them. But overall, do you feel has he been radical, or has he pulled his punches? What most catches your attention in all of this?
Yes, firstly, 88 is a lot of recommendations. And I think it's safe to say he's been more radical in some respects than I'd anticipated. which has its advantages, but also some risks. He's also been more clearly damning of Ofwat as a large part to blame. As Jon says, no one comes away looking clean in this industry, but he's particularly laid the blame at Ofwat's door. And I think there are some real positives for what's come out, including trying to set a new approach to the new regulator, the new merged regulator that builds on what's worked well in other sectors. So he talks quite a lot about Ofcom, where they've set out a new way of operating that allowed higher pay scales and therefore upskilling of the regulator so it could have the skills it needed to do the job well. And that feels really helpful. I also think Jon is very well linked into the civil service machinery. So it's unsurprising to see some of his recommendations get immediate acceptance. But I would just remind people about two really important things. The first is his recommendations are necessarily relatively high level, and the detail of how things will actually work in practice is really critical to what happens next. And within that detail, there could be quite a range between ways of this working that feel relatively comfortable for investors to ways that may feel substantially less comfortable. So that's quite important. And the second is there are 88 recommendations. We've already got several accepted, but they're unlikely to all be accepted. So being clear about which ones might not work and why is as important as focusing on how to get the ones working that the sector wants to work properly.
Certainly, it was interesting. And before we get into the detail, a bit more detail there, Eleanor, just to hear a little clip from the Environment Secretary, Steve Reed, when he was speaking following Sir Jon's report. And he had this to say.
For investors, it will end the tangle of ineffective regulation and provide the clarity and direction required for a strong partnership between government, the sector and investors to attract billions of pounds of new funding.
So Steve Reed there, Jon, talking about a strong partnership between government, the sector and investors. How are investors reacting to this report? Clearly it's early days. I think it's more than 400 pages, but are you getting a sense of how investors are feeling overall?
It is early days. And I think to Eleanor's point, I would say that the headlines that have come from the report, and in some cases immediately responded to by government, will be well received by the investor community. They needed to see a reset of the regulatory framework in water. They needed to see not only just an emphasis on the organizational structure of the regulators and the combining into one organization the varying functional requirements covering economic, environment, and these kind of really important issues. But also, there was much in this report about the need for cultural change and leadership in this new regulator, and I think that I believe will be very well received also by investors, because if you just have the same approach but just through a different organizational design, I don't think you get the change that you're looking for. So it needs to come alongside the skills that Eleanor made reference to, but also the culture and the whole approach, starting from the very top of the organization, to a need for a completely new mindset in the way that the regulator works with, alongside, and in some cases over the industry.
So that definitely sounds like cultural change, which is, I think we all know, one of the hardest things to achieve in business, and will no doubt take some time to get through. Eleanor, just thinking about some of the recommendations in more detail, one of them's to lower the levels of risk for investors in the water industry. But I think some people are thinking that this ambition could lead to an increase in regulatory intrusion, which in turn might limit the flexibility of boards of directors to make strategic, operational, financial, those kind of big decisions. What do you think? Is Sir Jon Cunliffe striking the right balance between risk and return?
He repeatedly talks all through his report about wanting us to return to being a low risk, low return sector. So I think the intent is really clear: more stable returns, more predictable returns, and therefore that lower risk that goes with it. But I can also understand some of the submissions he's had, which will have stressed those concerns about whether companies have acted in the best interests of their customers. So he is trying to put in place some protections against the perceived bad actors or potential for bad actors within the system. I also completely understand why these could be quite concerning to investors. For me, the key is what are the conditions around when those points might be used and whether they can be sufficiently described as last attempt rules so that they minimize those any broader impacts on how customers operate and when they invest. So in some ways, there's a little bit of a question here back to investors, which is where would some of the proposals Cunliffe's making stop you taking the right decisions? Be that the decision to invest in what otherwise would be a reasonable business. What efficient behaviour is this preventing? Can we constrain it so that it's just about that backstop, which later would need in place?
And and what about this? What about this shift away from the way Ofwat works, which is to have these industry-wide econometric models, to a new regulator having or using perhaps more tailored company-specific judgments when setting things like company allowances, performance targets, incentives, and so on? Again, is that good or bad?
I think this is a great step forward. For me, the benchmarking approach had just become mired in detail and complexity, but not really achieving the outcomes that were needed for anybody in the sector and at a massive cost. So the interesting change is we've now got this step back to an approach that is based around supervision. Interesting, just for a minute, just to focus on what supervision is. So it is about getting to know the company better. So it fits with that move away from benchmarking. It also enables to say you should have a smaller number of common PCs, but for those levels of performance commitments that you need to hit, they can be set on a company specific basis. So this avoids the need for everybody to have, say, a common leakage target. If people have got a long way to improve, they can have a reasonable target for a particular organization. So that feels sensible and helpful to companies. But let's just have a think about how supervision works in financial services. It is firmly there about avoiding harm, whether that's financial resilience risk or consumer harm. And for me, it's less clear how that applies to the sort of more economic regulation approaches of delivering a service in the water sector. So it talks about defining these new resilience standards. And I feel that's he's trying to design what you have to deliver against. And if you don't deliver those, then you're harming consumers or the environment. But this is all new. This needs developing. And as he admits, it will require legislation. So it's quite a way away from where we are. And the lesson to learn from financial services with supervision is because you've got somebody who's very close to the company and wanting to understand the company fully, it can risk greater requests for information and greater intervention in how a company operates because supervisors don't want things to go wrong on their watch. So not many people in the financial services sector would consider it a light-handed regulatory approach. And I think that's really important. So the key is going to be how this is done. There's a huge scope to influence that. It's nowhere near fixed. But that's going to be important for working out how this can operate and how this can operate without upping the regulatory burden on the firms involved.
Yeah, I have a sense that whilst the report and the recommendations are fantastic and give everybody in the industry and every consumer something to chew on, there's still a huge distance to go until actually things are implemented. And perhaps we'll come back to that in a minute. I was at the event in West London where Sir Jon unveiled his recommendations, and he was asked the question, how long is it going to take to come up with this new super regulator? And whilst he didn't answer it directly, he did give other examples of it being at least a couple of years to get through this process. But there are plenty of people who say there's a far easier solution to all of this than reinventing regulation, and that's nationalisation. The Labour government may have ruled it out. Maybe Sir Jon Cunliffe has said he can't find any causal link between private ownership and industry performance, but there are a lot of consumers and campaigners too who still believe that a return to public ownership is the answer. Is that something that should have been considered in your view?
Falling back on having previously been a Treasury official, so apologies about that that state in the course of this conversation. But if you're looking at this, as government already has many demands on its balance sheet. We know the water sector needs substantial investment. So if it takes this onto the government books, it's going to have to find that money itself. And that will either come from raising taxes or avoiding spending elsewhere, which neither of which to me look particularly appealing. That ignores the fact that these are private companies, so nationalising itself would cost money. And the government's run some numbers around this, even if it's just looking at one company in particular, as opposed to the whole industry. So what you're saying is, if you're talking about nationalisation, you're talking about an upfront cost and an ongoing cost to the public purse, which to me, at the moment, at this particular point in time, for our economy and the state of our public finances, does not feel like the right way forward. And it's back to, if we want that investment delivered, I think we need to find a way to engage with the private sector to align the incentives so that the private sector can deliver what the public sector requires, and that regime works for everybody.
Jon, you and I both work obviously on behalf of the world's leading investors in infrastructure, so it's perhaps hardly surprising that we're not here to make the case for nationalisation.
So Eleanor's talked about the public piggy bank is empty, and not only have you got the upfront cost of reacquiring the water, the estate that forms the water sector right now, which is probably way too expensive for any government to consider. But you've then got the ongoing responsibility for its upkeep and maintenance. Now, this is where a nationalised water industry failed previously, because governments of the day will allocate their own political priorities to how they spend the available funds that they have. And I can't see a world where water, as important as it is, where the water sector gets ahead of defence, education, welfare, future pension demands, etc., etc. So what all in my mind, all that will happen is that there'll be a flurry of priorities and promises which will over time get overlooked and changed to the point at which the water sector will be starved of public investment as other priorities come. It's much better, in my view, to have a privately owned sector where the right incentives are in place to make sure that we have a clear investment program that maintains the assets and builds for the future, and that is almost, not almost, it is legally required. It's baked into the system that way. We've got to have a better conversation about how we pay for our infrastructure, because even in a world where you nationalize, you still pay for the infrastructure that's needed. And you have to do it through taxation if you're not going to do it through bills. Nationalization, for me, is an ideological argument, and you can't change people's minds when they are ideologically fixed on a position. If you look at things pragmatically, then I think you come to different conclusions that nationalization would be the answer.
Certainly, the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, has been very clear that private investment is absolutely key to economic growth. As I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation of this episode, the government's also just published a 10-year infrastructure strategy as well. If you like, momentous times for infrastructure investment. How does that new strategy, Jon, how does that play into the broader picture for investors looking at opportunities more generally in the UK? I mentioned a bit earlier that the UK hasn't been perhaps top of the list for investors, but is that picture now changing?
Yeah, I think it is starting to change. And the starting point for me is that we've got 30 of our investor members at GIIA have a stake in a water company in the UK. So if there is widespread disaffection amongst investors in how the regulation of water has been undertaken over the last 10 years or so, then understandably that is going to create a negative sentiment towards the UK. And we've heard many times from individual investors that they couldn't bring themselves to put an investment case to their investment committee in the UK whilst the shambles has unfolded in UK water. So that's not everyone. I'm not speaking on behalf of all of our members, but certainly a number have made those kind of points to us. It was really important that the government sent a really strong signal about their review of the water sector, which they did, to their credit, very quickly after the election. They also promised that they would deliver a 10-year infrastructure strategy. And we worked really closely with the National Infrastructure Commission that was tasked with doing that. And the National Infrastructure Commission has now become known as NISTA, And credit to Darren Jones in the Treasury and the NISTA team, they've met their target. They produced a 10-year infrastructure strategy within the 12-month kind of cycle, and they should be given credit for that. And I think the very existence, the ambition to have a 10-year infrastructure strategy is a positive signal to investors. Then start looking into what it contains. It demonstrates much more joined up thinking within government that has been really lacking. It helps long-term investors to build a sense of confidence that the government's serious about a renewal of infrastructure programs. So they see that through the commitment to look at the planning laws. They see that through the commitment to relook at regulators' duties in regard to how regulators can contribute to growth as well as protect consumers. And they've also seen the pipeline, the infrastructure pipeline that has been published as part of the 10-year strategy. And although there's much more work to be done on the pipeline, because the existence of a pipeline is one thing, but what the content of it is the most important, and there's still a lot of work to do on the content of the pipeline. So I give credit to the government for driving through these headline initiatives. I think they're a very positive signal. They're much improved signals to the investor community than what we were getting under the previous regime. So far, so good, but as ever, all the detail needs to still be worked through. And we need to hold government's feet to the fire that actually produces, ultimately, it creates the investment environment that will unlock the capital. I think there's definitely an increase in the positive sentiment towards the UK when we've sat down with our members. There's a desire to put some of the difficulties of the past behind and relook at the UK as a new opportunity. And whether that is in the energy space, and maybe in transport too, there's some great opportunities coming down the line. Social housing is another area where I think investors will be taking a look at. So there's lots of opportunity still to play out, I think, and what these signals through the strategy, the industrial strategy, the planning reforms, these are all very welcome developments.
Eleanor, as Jon was saying there, a lot of UK infrastructure investment does take place within regulated sectors like water, transport, energy, communications, and so on. And I think it's fair to say that the UK system of regulation was once a gold standard around the world. But your firm, Fingleton, did earlier this year write a paper for us that was called How Regulatory Change Can Help Drive the UK's Growth Agenda. What more does you think government, you're an expert in this stuff, I mean, you work for a strategic regulatory advisor, what more does government need to do to secure the private investment that is needed for economic growth and for this government?
Certainly, is worth saying to start with, we were the gold standard. Inevitably, over time, things get bolted on and added and changed, and you end up with a system that doesn't work as well as it might. So it's completely normal for that to happen, and it's normal to have a reset. I'm quite encouraged by the fact that the recommendations we made in that piece of work we did for you seem to me increasingly to be accepted as the right way forward. So there's certain points there about having greater consistency in how regulators think about the weighted average cost of capital and how they set that. Points about how to, as Jon was mentioning, that simplification of decision making and giving a clear steer to investors about what is likely to happen or not. Also, in our view, that would also mean looking at the duties requires legislation. So I still have hope that will happen later in this year, but we shall have to wait and see for the next steps on that one. The government has firmly said it's looking at new strategic steers. Strategic steers are the way of the government giving the direction to the regulator. Sometimes those get used usefully, but they have to be really clear. And the risk is they become a bucket list of everything everybody wants. And then they don't really actually help the regulator take the right decisions. So I think there is increased recognition now that they can work. They haven't done particularly in most areas. Government often forgets how inconsistency in its approach adds to the cost to everybody else for engaging with it. And for me, that sort of first step forward would be having a consistent appeal standard for price regulations. Actually, that could help. It means there's just one way of operating, and you're not trying to say, okay, this happened over here, but in our regime, it's a little bit different, and you've got to do something else. So I hope we are moving towards a consistent approach in appeals. My slight wariness is, I know the CMA have said they would like price review appeals to move to the CAT, I think that's a risk for investors because actually having somebody who looks at it in the round as an economic and legal view is different to a very legal judgment view, which would be what you get from the CAT. And my worry is that would peel back into the price review process and turn that much more legalistic than the approach it is now. And for me, that would be a retrograde step. So consistency, yes, I would keep it with the CMA.
Sorry, I'm acronym phobic. Eleanor,
Apologies.
just remind our listeners what the CAT is.
So apologies, I should be really clear about that. So the CAT is the Competition Appeal Tribunal. So if you reach the end of the road with the Competition and Markets Authority, who hear the price review appeals, you can, at the moment, take some appeals to the Competition Appeal Tribunal, but that is a judicial review standard, so it's a legal standard. It's not, whereas the CMA takes a review on the basis of lining up with how the regulators should take decisions. So that includes economic reasons. I think that's important for some of the decisions we're talking about and some of the points that really matter for regulated companies.
Finally, to the future, and quick fire answers here, if you like. Obviously, the next thing that happens is the moment when the purity of Sir Jon Cunliffe's recommendations meet political reality. To what extent, Eleanor first, do you think the investors can expect Cunliffe's recommendations to survive in the pressure to deliver regulatory reform before the next election?
The next few months are going to be absolutely critical. So we're expecting a white paper in the autumn. And it's worth at this point flagging stakeholders have an opportunity here. So more radical reform will take longer. It could bump into both the next election and in the water sector preparation for PR29. But if you don't get enough change, we'll end up back in a similar situation to the one we've just had in the last few years. So for me, prioritizing and clearly evidencing a way forward that makes the necessary changes in the regulatory framework, while still importantly allowing investment to continue, feels critical. I think we've got a window of opportunity to make that work, but it's going to be in the details and it's going to be with the input of all the stakeholders about what can work and what can't and how to make this successful.
And Jon, what's the next job for the Global Infrastructure Investor Association now the report's out?
To have a holiday.
That's coming up for a lot of us at this time of year. But
Okay.
after the holiday,
After the holiday. Look, I think there's a lot of steps in the dance still to go. Eleanor's mentioned many of them. We've still got the outcome of the CMA appeals for 5 of water companies. That's really important. We've still got the future of Thames Water to play out. And that's also very significant. The white paper that the government has committed to publishing this autumn, we all know the autumn has a very broad kind of time band around it when it's government's version of autumn. So let's hope it's the earlier version of autumn rather than the late version of autumn, because otherwise I think it is going to start to get very difficult to see any primary legislation put through the system in time for it to be in effect before we get into PR29. Water has unfortunately become a very politicized football, whilst I think the industry will be broadly supportive of what the government plans to do going forward. If it's based largely on Sir Jon's recommendations, then I think then it will broadly get the support and engagement of the industry on the fine detail, how important as that is. But we're not able to factor in just yet, I think, how politics plays out. And unfortunately, I think the other political parties, the other 3 main political parties, are certain to try and continue to make water a political issue, which is unfortunate because it would be great if everybody actually could align around a long-term plan for the sector, but that's just not the way politics works. So there's that factor, I think, still to play out on all of that. But so with that as a background, GIIA will be engaging with DEFRA. We have built some good relationships, I think, at ministerial level as well as officials. They know that GIIA can convene very easily in most of the major investors in the sector that are interested in water, either now or might be in the future. And they use us, I think, effectively to help to structure and organize the right kind of engagement so that we can sometimes carry messages into government that individual investors prefer not to say, as well as to get the right people around the table to help brainstorm some of the challenges. That's what we've been doing, and I think that's what we'll continue to do. Make ourselves as useful as we can on behalf of the sector.
Thank you for joining us on Talking Global Infrastructure with John Phillips of the Global Infrastructure Investor Association, Eleanor Mack of the Strategic Regulatory Advisor Fingleton, and myself, Simon Montague. If you're new to our podcast, or indeed new to us, you can find lots more about us on our website at GIIA.net, including insights on what we're doing to influence the future of the water industry, as well as help the government shape a long-term strategy for UK infrastructure. You can, of course, also follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or indeed on YouTube, so you never miss an episode. And you can also find us on LinkedIn and join our mailing list for all our latest news and insights as we continue our global work. And if you want to tell us what you think or have an irresistible idea for a show, then please do email us at communications@giia.net. I do hope you've enjoyed this episode and that you'll be joining us again next time. Goodbye.